Hello and welcome to the Pivot Leadership Podcast. I'm Emma Chandler and I'm excited to have you here today as we explore the science of leadership, dive into how the brain works and hopefully learn a few things that will transform the way you lead. I created the Pivot framework to help leaders change their work environments for the better by harnessing the power of neuroscience. Whether you're guiding your team through change or looking to elevate your own leadership game, this podcast is designed to help you unlock the next level of success. So, what does it mean to pivot? Well, it's all about mastering perseverance, inclusion, value, optimization, and trust. These 5 principles are the building blocks of leadership that lasts. Throughout this podcast, I'll be joined by inspiring guests as we unpick each of these competencies and share actionable insights on how to apply them. So lean in, get ready to lead, pivot, and unlock your potential. In this episode, I'm joined by Hayley Brackley as we explore the pivot principle, inclusion. Hayley is a neurodiversity coach, trainer, and keynote speaker on a mission to transform workplaces through neuroinclusion. Diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia 22 years ago, and recently discovering she's autistic, her lived experience drives her passion at Great Minds Don't. Hayley empowers neurodivergent individuals, delivers impactful training for teams and leaders, and shares her story to promote understanding and inclusion. Her work includes coaching, awareness training, and upskilling managers to create workplaces where everyone can thrive, regardless of how their brain works. We're going to chat about Hayley's personal journey with ADHD, her experience in the workplace as a leader, and also now in her own business, helping organisations be more inclusive. Welcome to the podcast, Hayley. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Emma. Thank you very much for having me here.
No worries. I give you a bit of an intro there, but I know there's loads more that you've done. Could you give our audience and listeners a little bit more info about you?
Absolutely. So as you rightly said, I am diagnosed with ADHD, dyslexia and autism. And that puts me into that banner of being neurodivergent. My work really centres around how do we create a workplace where everybody gets to come to work and have a good day at work. And the reason that I found myself, as most of us do when we have a job that we love, accidentally in this position, is because I was in a workplace where I didn't have that opportunity. I was in a workplace where I didn't get to thrive. And if I look back at that now, it was really due to all of the peripheral things. It wasn't the work itself. It was things like the social environment, the arbitrary rules. And what that meant was that actually I ended up leaving that workplace, and that workplace missed out on the talent I had available, and I missed out on a job that I enjoyed, all because of things that could be different. And I just think that shouldn't be happening. And so that's really where I come from when I come to work. And as you say, I now have that brilliant joy of running a business and being able to work with so many different organisations, individuals, and really looking at what works well, what works less well. And that's both on a systemic organisational basis, but also on an individual basis. You know, if you've grown up in a world that was built for the neurotypical, the typical way of a brain working, and your brain doesn't work in that typical way, you may have absolutely no idea of the little tiny strategies that make a huge difference to your day because you've never seen them before. And I get the joy of bringing those in.
I love that. So for our listeners, just so that we, with the benefit of our listeners and so they understand, because I'm not sure, if I'm honest, I truly understand. I'm always learning in this space. So what exactly does neurodiversity mean, or neurodivergent versus neurotypical, just so we can get a really good understanding of that?
Absolutely. So neurodiversity is a word that encapsulates all of us. Every single one of us falls under that banner of neurodiversity because we all have a brain that works differently. So if we were to look at our fingerprints, we all have a different fingerprint. And if we were to scan our irises, we all have a different iris. we also each have a different brain, and so we process the world around us differently. So my preferences, my strengths, my challenges are going to be different from yours and different from every single one of our listeners. You know, we're never going to find two people that are identical. So that is neurodiversity. The word neurodivergent is a word that came later. Neurodiversity we've been talking about since the late 90s. Neurodivergent is a much more recent word, and what that word is describing those who differ from the majority, or the typical way that we would expect a brain to work in our society. And so, to put it a little bit more simply, we're looking at traits, conditions, differences such as ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. It's a very non-exhaustive list though, because when we look at, PTSD, multiple sclerosis, actually are those brains working in a typical way? We might say that they're not, and in which case it does become this huge umbrella with no definitive endpoint as to what we're including, and that can be a little bit confusing. So the flip side of this is neurotypical, and that is a brain that works in the way that we as a society deem to be typical. Now, there is no test to confirm somebody is neurotypical. So I know a great number of people who believed themselves to be neurotypical until the point where perhaps their child had been diagnosed dyslexic or ADHD, and they'd then gone for an assessment themselves and gone, oh, okay, I am also. And so again, we've got a bit more of a grey area of who really is neurotypical and how do we define that?
Ooh, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, this on the topic of inclusion, we're now already starting to get into, if it doesn't directly touch us, it touches somebody else close to us. And what is typical? What is difference? Is it actually anything? Is it something?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is if we say, let's look at ADHD for an example, the traits that we would associate with ADHD might include concentration difficulties, emotional dysregulation, sleep disruption. Now, let's look at perimenopause. So somebody who does not have ADHD, up until the point they hit perimenopause, absolutely would have believed themselves to be neurotypical, hits perimenopause and has concentration difficulties, emotional dysregulation and sleep disruption. Now, that doesn't mean that they've suddenly got ADHD, but what it does mean is the conversation that you had 2 years ago about ADHD is now going to have a knock-on impact for this person that's hit menopause, because if you're designing a workplace for absolute inclusion of all neurotypes, those of us that transition through our brains working differently, such as perimenopause or stress relating to a divorce, or anything that means that our brains are working differently for a particular period of our life, we've already kind of then had the conversation that puts us on a really good start for that person as well.
Yeah. No, that's really, really interesting, because what I just heard then was that, we could all be touched at this at any point during our career through either health changes in our body that impact on our brain, or a significant event in our life, when we touch on the PTSD, or it could be that we are diagnosed with neurodiversity of some description. Can you talk to us about your journey of that then, so people can understand your journey? I remember seeing a post on LinkedIn, it's probably a couple of years ago, maybe more, maybe 3 years ago now. And this is the power of LinkedIn, isn't it? And the power of great posts. So congratulations on this one. It's really stuck with me. You actually talked about through the eyes of you as a child, and when you realized that you were neurodiverse, and I'm not sure if you were diagnosed at that point or if you just realized, and you really shared something and the symptoms you're experiencing. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and your journey to diagnosis, I guess, and then understanding that?
Absolutely. So my diagnosis came in 2002. At that point, there was no information, there was no understanding about it. I had completed several rounds of anger management training before that as a teenager. I'd unsuccessfully completed many rounds of CBT. I'd been told that my brain doesn't work properly, that I was broken, that I needed to try harder and think differently and just fix myself. And I really struggled in school. I found it really overwhelming. And now that I look back, actually, and now that I'm a parent as well, and I see school from a totally different angle, I can see that although symptomatically you look at my school reports and it'll tell you I didn't produce any work, even though I was probably very capable of doing so, actually the bit that I found hardest was the social side of school. It was getting friends, maintaining friends, understanding how social nuances work, not feeling so utterly distraught. It felt like somebody had fallen out with me or that I'd done something wrong. And actually they were the things that probably had the biggest impact, which is ironic because now I look at that and can see that they're probably the traits that, if I look at all of my neurotype, fit most with the autism diagnosis, which I got in adulthood. I didn't get that as a child. Now, at the time, I went through all of this struggle, and at the time I was diagnosed, it was ADD. So I was told I had ADD and that was an explanation. The psychiatrist told me this is an explanation of why your brain is broken, why you do things wrong. And, that was a sign of the times. We didn't have the affirming language that we have now. We didn't consider the benefit of diversity. It was all steeped in deficit. It was very much, this is what's wrong with you, and you won't achieve a potential because you're incapable of behaving in a normal way, and I now put inverted commas every time I say the word normal, because really what is normal? And there wasn't any community. I was the first girl that he'd diagnosed. He had absolutely no idea what the relationship between ADHD medication and hormones and periods was going to be, and kind of just said, I'm going to treat you like you're a boy and see what happens along the way. So it wasn't a positive experience. And sometimes we can see late diagnosis as a really negative thing, and actually I would say it's about understanding as opposed to diagnosis. I had, by definition, an early diagnosis, but quite a late understanding of that diagnosis because the information just wasn't in the world for us to get that understanding from.
And those messages that you heard then at that early years, they've stuck with you. We're talking about it today. It's actually so kind of damaging, really, to somebody who has just got talents and can express talents and share talents in a different way.
Yeah.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, because, there were times where you were talking there, my eyebrows were up, I was mouth open, but I didn't want him to come in there because it's such a powerful and impactful story. The transition then from childhood into the workplace, how did you kind of bring your whole self to that? Because, that must have been quite a challenge at points.
It definitely was. And again, when I joined the workplace, there wasn't the conversations that we have today. And actually, there wasn't the self-understanding. So I very much joined the workplace believing that was a school thing. ADHD and dyslexia were a school thing. I was told very categorically, you've outgrown this, you're 16. And I went into a role processing housing benefit, which was so dull, so repetitive, so mundane, busy, open plan office with lots of temptation of people to talk to rather than doing your job. And I found it really difficult. My accuracy wasn't brilliant. I probably wasn't in the right role. I was really, really good at interviewing, and that's how I got the job. I was good at maths and I was good at interviewing, and that's what was assessed. But what wasn't assessed was your appetite for repetition, your ability to concentrate in a very, like I say, mundane environment. And so I left there and I went into another role. I joined the fire service, and in a lot of ways that was fabulous. But actually, like I say, the kind of communication side of things, the sensory side of things, the social nuances, I found really challenging in that environment, so much so that I ended up having a breakdown. And actually, if I look back now, much of that was down to just one person, one manager, who, through, I would say, ignorance more so than anything else, was utterly unequipped to have good conversations, to be, supportive, to be that good manager, that now I know what that looks like. I can see the difference.
Well, and we talk a lot on the Pivot program, we talk a lot about the impact of the leader being the environment for people, and actually understand the level of responsibility that comes with that in your leadership, that you are the environment for your team, or a big part of the environment for your team. And what you just talked about there is an example of a leader being in that environment, whether it was intentional or not, or a lack of understanding, how that impacted you. And you talked about a breakdown. What did that look like? Did you leave the workplace? Was it a period off? How did that kind of manifest and show up?
So my breakdown was, yes, I did leave the workplace. I was taken out of the role that I was in, a role that I was good at, and put into a different role for a period of time. And ultimately, when that became unworkable, as in the organisation needed me to move back, I couldn't do it. And actually, I would recognise in myself a trauma response in that I couldn't go back into that building. I was having panic attacks at the idea of speaking to colleagues. And it was really damaging. And I would say probably took me about 5 years to fully recover from that experience. I was really lucky. I had an amazing therapist. I worked through a lot of the challenges that had come from that workplace, but also some of the things, that therapist was the first person that told me that I'm not broken. And I was in my late 20s by this point. And so it wasn't just the workplace, but it's more than our own history. It's more than that. And so, yeah, the breakdown it totally destroyed me. I contemplated whether being here was the right place for me to be in the world generally. And, a workplace should never have that level of impact on somebody. It should never have the opportunity to take a mother away from their children, or, anybody away from the world just because the workplace is not equipped.
Absolutely. And that's the impact, isn't it? That's the negative power and impact of the workplace. I want to harness that and flip that and make workplaces great, as I know you do too. So if we look at that journey for you, I think we could get some real good lived experience and insight. If I'm a leader of a team and I've potentially got neurodiverse people in my team, I probably have, whether diagnosed or not. So, we should all just be thinking about leading in this way to be inclusive. What would be the approach to that kind of scenario that I would need to take that would be more enabling than the experience that you went through? Because I know there'll be leaders listening thinking, help, what do? I don't want to find myself in this situation.
Absolutely. So the first thing that I always recommend is conversation and curiosity. So we as humans are programmed to have assumptions, to have biases, to jump to conclusions. And sometimes they can really trip us up. So we can see that somebody's not done something and we can make an assumption that they've not done it because they are, insert word here, but perhaps lazy or demotivated or sloppy or inconsistent or whatever it may be. And actually there might be a totally different reason why that's happened. So if we can approach a situation with curiosity, if we can look at each person and think, what does this person bring? How can I enable them to bring that in the very best way that they can? Also, if we can think about what's called a neuronormative bias. Now, a neuronormative bias is that neurotypical way is normal, is right, it's the way that we should all be. And we have this in terms of timekeeping as one example. We have a neuronormative bias that the most professional person in a team is the one that gets there on time. We have another neuronormative bias, which is that everybody should be able to take minutes at a meeting. And these neuronormative biases, they can go all the way through. If we look at any aspect of work, we can pick out neuronormative bias. Another one that I talk about a lot is around feedback. For many neurodivergent folk, there is heightened emotional dysregulation and potentially something called RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Now, if we take this into account and we think about our feedback culture, we want to see feedback as a gift. We want to regularly give spontaneous feedback. We want to have a yearly appraisal where we'll talk about everything that you've done in one really intense conversation. And again, it's steeped in neuronormative bias, because there's that bias that says, Emma, you should be capable of me in the moment spontaneously surprising you with something that is going to feel quite uncomfortable and painful. And you should be absolutely fine. And if you could answer that with a smile on your face, that would be lovely. Because it's a gift, don't forget. But actually, it's not for everybody. And so we absolutely have to step back and look at all of the stuff that we've learned about humans and question it. Where did that come from? How is it working for us? How is it serving us? And how is it tripping us up? To then look at relearning humans, relearning how people work, and figuring out different ways of doing stuff.
I love that. So curious, feedback, and relearn about humans. And when you just described something there, I'm going to have like a confession moment on my own podcast. We recently delivered a years-long leadership program, and it wasn't until we were halfway through that it became apparent to me that we had a number of neurodivergent people in the room, and that the way I was doing things wasn't working. And mid-program, I had to kind of completely rechange the way that I've always done things in learning and development and coaching, and not be me for a while, and change that to meet the needs of my audience. And it was such a huge learning piece for me, because I was doing that because I've 10 years in, being quite successful in what I'm doing, and having great feedback usually. And then on this one occasion, it was, why do you expect us to just enjoy this? And I was like, I don't know, because everyone's always enjoyed it before. And I'd never really questioned it. So I had my own bias about how I was delivering my own learning interventions. So it's super, super huge and massive for leaders to take this on and question those behaviours that they first see in the workplace from people, and not think it's a performance issue, and actually try and understand what that behaviour is about, I guess, or what's the reactions about.
Definitely.
So that's a big piece of learning on my own podcast. Thank you. I knew I was going to learn things today. The other interesting bit that you talked about there, I just wanted to shine a light on, was the deficiency comments. So I've had experience of this myself. I don't know if you can help our listeners and leaders with any more, so they understand what we mean by this. But I also entered for an award for a program that I delivered that had neurodiversity elements in it. And the judges were asking me questions around the inclusion aspect. And one of the questions was, did you see a reduction in the speed in which the organisation could perform due to the level of neurodiversity in the organisation? And my jaw just dropped with the question, because I hadn't even thought that would have even been a consequence. So it's that deficit language or deficit view on that is still very present, and that is in a prestigious awards arena. So yeah, it's super interesting, and I think leaders need to understand just that, so they've got a check on this about their responses to that. I don't know what your views are or what your experiences are on this deficit language. I know you talked about it in early years, but definitely in the workplace it can creep in.
It absolutely can. And it starts with what's wrong with that person. Well, there's nothing wrong with that person. There's something different about that person. And again, it comes back to that bias that there's a right way of doing things, and that if you don't adhere to that right way of doing things, then you're going to slow things down. You're going to be a burden. This is going to be a difficulty. And actually, I could name off the top of my head of my clients probably a couple of hundred neurodivergent people who are massively positively impacting their organisation. But the only way that they can do that is if there's the environment and space for them to do it. And so I would encourage flipping that to say, what benefit do you get from including everybody? And you need a 30-second search on something like Harvard Business Review to understand how diversity is good for business. It's good for profit, it's good for productivity, it's good for innovation, it's well researched. And neurodiversity definitely falls under that banner. So it is absolutely good for business. And I rarely talk about the kind of I suppose, famous people who sit in this neurodiversity camp, because I think sometimes we can go too far and look at it in terms of a superpower, like dyslexic thinking is going to totally innovate the world because Richard Branson is dyslexic and he came up with a multi-million-pound enterprise. And so every dyslexic person's going to do the same. And that's simply not true. But actually, before we start saying that including neurodivergence in your workplace is going to slow us down, let's just look at one person. Let's look at Richard Branson. Can you imagine saying, I'm not going to hire him because it will slow us down?
Yeah, I know. And the thing is, that program actually was a huge success once I managed to adjust my way of leading it and I understood it. And actually, it's now shaped future leadership development from my perspective as well. So it's got a legacy to what happened there. So the answer to the question to the judges is no, I didn't see that. We just adapted and evolved with it. And it was a huge success. So yeah, from today, let's have a big no to any kind of deficit language going on around the diversity here. In terms of you being a leader, so I'm guessing we've got some leaders listening and thinking, I'm neurodivergent, I'm the leader. So that's like another lens to kind of look through. Can you talk about how you balance managing your own neurodiversity whilst leading and supporting others? Because there's a huge element there, isn't there, on emotional support and performance management when doing that whilst looking after your own resilience. So can you talk a bit about that? Because I think that's an interesting insight for leaders.
Definitely. And you're right, it is a massive balancing act, trying to facilitate the right thing for other people, but also live well for yourself. I take the responsibility of leading other people really, really seriously because I have seen firsthand the impact of getting that wrong. And I, from a personal perspective, it would be remiss of me to say, well, it's fine, I don't need to provide a team around me with what they need because I'm the neurodivergent one. But at the same time, I need to take that responsibility to think, how can I do this at my best? One of the things that has the biggest impact for me is that open communication, being able to say, okay, so I'm going to find this challenging. Have you got any ideas of how we could do it differently? Or this is where I'm at today, but if you need anything, let me know. And so just being really open with other people. And the great thing about that is when we have appropriate vulnerability, when we share enough so that we're not deluging people with us, but we're giving insights, we encourage that to come the other way. And then we can start to look at, okay, so if we put ourselves together, how does that then create a shape of all of us? How do we fit into each other's gaps? And are there overlaps? Are there bits missing? And by us really looking at it as, I am a leader, but I'm also part of this team. And there's no one way to be a leader. And so sometimes it is about saying, yeah, I might be the leader, but I am the worst organised person in this team. So let's look at who's the best organised and how do we champion them for what they do really well, what they bring. It might be that you say, I am the leader, but you know what? I know that if we're pitching an idea, so-and-so is going to be so much better at delivering that message than I will be. And so rather than me go and muffle my way through it, I'm going to champion this other person and say, they're really good at this. Let's give them the opportunity to step forward and do it. And ultimately, leading a team is having a pool of resources, of which you are one of them, and creating the best opportunity for all of those resources.
Yeah. So appropriate vulnerability there. I really like that. Championing others and creating opportunities. These are really good tips for leaders. So in your view then, do you think that there's still a lack of support and understanding about neurodiversity in the workplace?
Yeah, there definitely is. It is getting so much better. If we look at 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't have invited me on a podcast to talk about this because who would have listened? It'd have been one of the kind of lowest performing podcasts. Nobody would have known what it was going to be about. But it's not where it needs to be. Unfortunately, we've still got people who aren't able to share what works well for them. There are people who don't have that self-understanding because the knowledge isn't out there. There are people who are still being discriminated against very actively because of who they are or how they work. Being told, I worked with somebody who was told that until they could work on their monotone voice, they wouldn't be promoted. But at the same time, they're being told that they absolutely have the talent to be promoted and that the organisation needs them to work on their monotone voice in order to promote them. And actually, you look at that and you just think that is just downright discrimination. There's nothing about that we can quantify in any different way. And so there is definitely not just the support, but hugely the understanding and the awareness. We're definitely not there in getting that across for everybody.
No, I think you're right. I think we are moving in the right direction, but we're not quite there yet. So looking ahead, what are your kind of hopes for the future with neurodiversity in the workplace? Kind of what changes do you think we should be looking to see in the next sort of 5 to 10 years?
I mean, if we look to the far end of that, what I'd really love is a point where we've almost made this conversation redundant.
Yeah.
Because we just accept difference and we work around each other, and we don't have all of these round holes for the square shaped and the star shaped and the diamond shaped pegs. Actually, it's just a big bunch of Play-Doh where whatever shaped peg you are, you fit and it works around you. That, on a utopian goal, that would be where I'd love to see things go.
Well, I'm advocating that for sure.
Definitely. I think if we make that more tangible, it's about the flexibility, it's about the understanding, the awareness, the compassion, the conversations, and just the opportunity where people can come in and say, I talk a lot about kryptonite and spinach. So kryptonite is something that holds back Superman and stops Superman from being able to use the things that are super. And spinach is what gives Popeye that added boost, takes Popeye from being the regular person in the calf to being something marvellous. And if we think about each of us in our roles, we each have spinach and we each have kryptonite. And so getting to a point where we just accept that, what's your spinach, what's your kryptonite? For me, it's filling in forms. Oh, well, that doesn't bother me, so why don't I fill in those forms? That's not an issue. Well, my spinach is going and standing and talking to people, so how do I do more of that for our team? And that just become regular. That's the way that we work. How marvellous would that be?
I love that. It's so fluid. I love it. And without judgment as well.
Definitely.
Love that. So I want to ask you sort of one last thing more about your company now and where you are today, because I know you've got a great kind of step out of corporate story into your own business. And I know that you've just recently done a TED Talk, but could you tell us a bit more about your company, what you're doing at the moment, what you're up to, and how you're changing workplaces for the better? Because I know you are.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. So Great Minds Don't, I say we as though there's loads of us. It's me and somebody who absolutely covers my kryptonite with her spinach and organises for us. So the two of us, it's me that comes into the organisations, it's me that works with individuals, and that can be all sorts of things, looking the entire life cycle of an employee. What is your recruitment looking like? What's onboarding looking like? Is there awareness, not just in managers and leaders, but actually in people? Because it's all well and good, the manager knowing why you do something, but Francis that's sitting next to you getting frustrated with why that thing's not happened or why that thing has happened, maybe Francis could do with understanding neurodivergence a little bit better. Increasing the awareness, giving people the skill set, working on the strategy. What is your strategy towards neuroinclusion? How are you going to get there? But also, massively important is that space for neurodivergent individuals to have a really safe space. And I offer standard kind of, and I say standard in inverted commas, but standard leadership coaching, but I also offer a great deal of neurodiversity coaching. And there is a bit of a difference in that sometimes with neurodiversity coaching, we never even set the goal because there isn't a particular goal, because you don't know what the goal might be until you get to the end of it and realise what's made a difference for you. And in an organisation, that can be a little bit tricky where we're used to coaching looking like, that workplace coaching with the GROW model, and what are we working towards, and how are we going to get there, and what's our steps, and how will we know we've achieved it? Oh, and let's add a SMART target, because everybody wants to measure it. And just as a side FYI, SMART targets for me are enough to put me off ever doing a piece of work, because by the time I've sat and worked out what was smart about it, I've lost all inclination and motivation and energy to do it. But coming back to the coaching, sometimes it's just about having a space to come and process, a space to understand what's going on, to figure out how that works for you, how it doesn't, what's holding you back. But in a conversation that is so far removed from anything you've had access to before that you couldn't comprehend a goal right at the beginning of it. And so creating that opportunity to have those conversations, but also creating an environment in a workplace where that becomes an okay thing to do all the time. It's okay to go to your manager and have a conversation that says, I just need to kind of process this ball of spaghetti and see what's inside it.
Yeah, I love that. I wrote down already for my own coaching notes, when I'm now thinking about being more inclusive in my coaching without goals and non-quantifiable coaching. I mean, that would be so kind of far away from everything that I ever get commissioned to do, but I'm going to start advocating that for sure. So that's amazing. So you're out doing awareness training, you're out doing leadership and neurodiversity coaching. That's fab. So tell us about the TED Talk. What was that about?
The TED Talk is something that has always been on my list to do. And from right when I first saw a TED Talk, I was like, oh my word, I'd love to do that. And actually, as what happens with many neurodivergent folk, you grow up being told all the things that you're not good enough at and all the things that you will never amount to. And I didn't see it at the time, but my absolute self-assumption was they won't want me. I'm not the sort of person that does that. You know, like they'll want the proper people. Hilariously, they'll want the clever people. Now,
the people with the working brain, right? The people with the working brain, that very first message when you were younger.
Yeah. And what is hilarious is that, you know, I got accepted into Mensa, which means I'm definitely not clever. But for some reason, that's where my brain went to. And so I got the opportunity. Somebody said to me, you know, we're putting on this TEDx event. Would you like to come and be part of it? The kind of theme that we would see you fill in is the ability, not disability. And I was like, oh,
love that.
Yes, please. Yeah. I'd really like to come and do this. Thank you very much. And so that was what I covered. And I sort of did a blend of this is my story. And that's the way I work. I do a lot of storytelling. So I did this is my story and this is, you know, what can happen. But actually, what happens if we flip it and we look at ability? And I talked about a manager that I had who was fabulous, who looked at what I did well, who, when I was struggling with things, would just kind of come and sit next to me and say, what would work, what would help, and didn't judge it. So, for example, one of the things was that I'd got so overwhelmed with filling in paperwork. I managed apprentices, and I'm sure you know, apprenticeship paperwork is like something that the devil concocted, I'm sure. And I was so overwhelmed with filling it all in. And she just came and sat next to me with a bag of jelly babies. That was it. And that was all I needed, was just somebody to be there, so that when I did get stuck, I could be like, what does that question mean? And how do you think I should answer that? But also just the moral support to then crack out the next 15 of them. And that lack of judgment, that I'm just here for what you need, that in turn enabled me to see the ability that I do have, and in myself go from feeling disabled to feeling capable. And that's really the benefit of a fantastic leader, is, you know, what a power to have in somebody else's life, to be able to offer them that feeling of capability.
Wow, that's so powerful. So from the disability to ability and the capability and the power of a leader. So I saw a picture of you on LinkedIn as soon as I saw it. And then I saw your post about what it's like to prepare for a TED Talk when you've got ADHD. Because I was just really thinking, oh my gosh, the challenges you're overcoming, and you're so authentic and you're able to share that, you know, it was just so powerful. So I'm like your number one fan to watch this TED Talk. I can't wait until it is live. And particularly how you've gone down that leadership aspect too. I mean, that'll be great for the Pivot Leadership podcast community to listen into. So thank you so much for telling us about it. I loved, can you just share what was in the post about your dress the day before? Because that, just so we can end on that, because I just found that, can you remember?
Yeah, it was just hilarious. Some of the things that I hadn't contemplated at all, like getting there, and it was the washing of the dress. I suddenly realised that I hadn't washed it. And I was like, oh, I should probably do that sometime soon, shouldn't I? Since I'm leaving. And so many things. And it so often is the case. I recently did a recorded talk, and I kind of decided, really, as I was walking onto the stage, what it was I was going to talk about. that bit just had sort of eluded me up until that time. But this is one of the marvellous things about getting to a point where you can work with your brain, because years ago I would have taken that internalised neuronormative bias and I'd have berated myself and I'd have been so frustrated. I'd have probably cancelled, because I'd have felt like I was doing it wrong because I hadn't come up with it beforehand. I wasn't thoroughly planned. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't laid out. And actually now, understanding my brain and knowing that sometimes my brain is just not going to be able to go there, but it will in the moment. And that's because it is neurology. It's the difference in brain chemicals when you get that adrenaline flowing and you take away all the other distractions, because there's not many distractions when you're already stood on the stage, let's face it. Then all of a sudden it comes. And being able to trust in myself that that's going to work, and that I don't have to beat myself up, that I don't have to do what other people would do, it's magic. It honestly, I can't describe it in any different way. It just feels like magic.
That's amazing. That is so amazing that you can do that, and that you trust your brain to do that, and that that is how you work. And the perception of that could be so many different things from so many other people. But I love that it works for you, and that's okay. Thank you so, so much for sharing that.
You are more than welcome. I think the other thing is that I wouldn't then assume that of somebody else. I'm not going to be like, no. Emma, come and do this thing for me in 30 seconds time, because as you walk on the stage, you'll just know what to say. I'm open to the fact that that's what works for me, but for somebody else, they might need, the 6 weeks notice. They might need a proper script. They might need some ideas, something to follow, because we are different, aren't we? And there's not a better or worse or right or wrong. It's just different.
Just different. Yeah. And what a beautiful place for us to finish up. So can you tell us then where our listeners can learn more about you? Where can they search you out?
Absolutely. So LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me, although don't send me a message because you'll get lost in the sea of people trying to sell me stuff. So LinkedIn, definitely come and find me on LinkedIn. My website, greatmindsdon't.co.uk. Pop me an email if you'd like to. That's really the kind of number one places I hang out. I think it'd be a bit strange if people turned up at my local pub for a chat.
Definitely, although you could expect to see me now. We've had this chat and we're friends.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights on how we can make workplaces more inclusive through the angle of neurodiversity. Your story is inspiring. I love the work that you do, and I feel that you are a part of the Pivot community now that you've been on the podcast. So thank you so much for giving us your time today.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me and creating the space to talk about neurodivergence.
Thank you for listening to the Pivot Leadership Podcast. For any information on anything we discussed in this episode, head down to the show notes. You'll also find my Pivot scorecard there, so you can take the test and see what your Pivot score is right now. Don't forget to like, rate and share the podcast, and subscribe now so you don't miss out on any future episodes.